Greetings. I hope you're having a good day today. We're going to be talking today about the build up to the Civil War and the events that lead up to that. We've already been talking about some of those things. And we'll talk more specifically about the election of 1860 and up to the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. I think that's probably where we'll get to in this presentation today. So we're going to see the Civil War. You know, one of the things that reminds me, just looking at this initial photograph here, is that this is the first period where we're going to have actual photographs that we can see. And that's going to give us quite a view of the Civil War. And so here you see one of those photographs. Looks like Union troops gathered around a fire outside, posing for this photograph. Well, the pivotal person in this period, leading right up to the Civil War, is Abraham Lincoln, of course. And here you see a photograph of Abraham Lincoln in his the style that we have grown accustomed to seeing him, with his beard. He actually grew the beard as a way to sort of change his look after some people recommended it, especially I think a teenage girl, wrote to him and said, "You need to grow a beard." So he did, which is interesting. Abraham Lincoln, I've been to his cabin. You can see his cabin where he was born. And you can go to the spot in Kentucky where he was born. He lived there for a few years, probably up to about the age of 5 or 6 years old. Then I like to say he spent his formative years in Indiana, because that's my home state. He moves to southern Indiana. He's there until probably an early teenager, somewhere in that neighborhood, in his teens. And then, of course, he's most often identified with Illinois. And he moves into Illinois, and it'll be Illinois where really he becomes a lawyer and a politician. But he grew up in a very small log cabin and was pretty much self-educated from borrowing books. He trains as a lawyer in Illinois, and he will eventually enter that practice in the Springfield, Illinois area, center of the state and the capital of the state. He will serve in the Illinois legislature, that's on the state level, and he serves one term in the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives. Most famously, he comes to national attention, I would think it'd be safe to say, in 1858. Here he ran against Stephen Douglas of Illinois, running for the Senate. And of course, this gets highly publicized because Lincoln and Douglas will debate each other. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates are well recorded. People there write down what they say. They're published in newspapers, will appear in print. And because of this, Lincoln became a national figure and decides to run for president in 1860, just 2 years later. Now, remember, we have the Republican Party, or sometimes called the GOP, the Grand Old Party. That's what GOP stands for. And this is a newly formed political party. focused mostly in the North, and wants the freedom of slaves, certainly doesn't want to see slavery expanded. And so when they're looking for a candidate in 1860, everybody says, let's get this tall lawyer from Illinois to run for president. And of course, he does. I think we might call him a moderate by the standards of his day. He was opposed to the expansion of slavery. I don't know if you would call him a strong abolitionist, that he just wanted to free all the slaves all at once, all across the country. That really wasn't his position, I don't think, at that time. But he did want the emancipation of slavery, which would be a process, instead of freeing everyone all at once, sort of at the same time. Emancipation would come more slowly, say as a master would die, the slaves would be freed. So we kind of come over more slowly, freedom would come. But at any rate, that's not what he's remembered for now, mostly, because the situation he will find himself in is going to lead to events, obviously the Civil War, that is going to change the direction of his political life and his real life. Right? Well, in debating Stephen Douglas, here's August 1st, 1858, I ask you, are you in favor of conferring upon a Negro the rights and privileges of citizenship? Do you desire to strike out our state constitution, that clause which keeps savages and free Negroes out of the state, and allow the free Negroes to flow in, and cover your prairies with black settlements? Do you desire to turn this beautiful state into a free Negro colony, in order that when Missouri abolishes slavery, she can send 100,000 emancipated slaves to Illinois to become citizens and voters on the equality with yourself? So this is, you can see the issue of slavery there in 1858. Stephen Douglas was from the Democratic Party, Democrat, and he never, like some politicians, he doesn't come right out and say he's pro-slavery, but you can tell, from his comments that he certainly appears to be that. He goes on to say, if you desire Negro citizenship, if you desire to allow them to come into the state and settle with the white man, if you desire them to vote on an equality with yourself and to make them eligible to office, to serve on juries, to adjudicate your rights, then support Mr. Lincoln and the Black Republican Party, who are in favor of the citizenship of the Negro. For one, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. So you can judge Stephen Douglas's words for yourself. And he goes on to say, I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. I am in favor of confining citizenship to white men, men of European birth and descent, instead of conferring it upon Negroes, Indians, and others of other inferior races. So you can see pretty clearly his position here. I don't think there's any doubt about it at this point. Abraham Lincoln, in contrast, we see this was August 1st, 1858. They had a series of debates It wasn't just one debate, sort of like we do now. It's all televised and it's a couple hours long, maybe one or two debates. They did a series of debates in person at different locations, but many hours debating. Well, on August 27th, 1858, Abraham Lincoln says, "I will take up the judges' interrogations," there he's speaking of Douglas, "as I find them printed in the Chicago Times, and answer them seriatim. In order that there may be no mistake about it, I have copied the interrogatories in writing, and also my answers to them. The first one of these interrogatories is in these words. Question number 1. I desire to know whether Lincoln today stands as he did in 1854 in favor of the unconditional repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act. Answer. I do not now, nor did I stand in favor of the unconditional repeal of the Fugitive Slave Law. And so many people cry out, good, this is the report, written report of it, which is interesting. And of course, if we were in class right now, I would give somebody an imaginary gold star if they could tell me what the Fugitive Slave Law was. But I'll have to forego that today. But of course, this means that if a slave ran away, got out of a slave state, and ran into a free state, what would happen? The Fugitive Slave Law, you remember, came into place, I believe, during the Missouri Compromise. Part of what led to some of these compromises that we've been going through with Missouri and the Compromise of 1850, which is specifically says then that if a fugitive runs into another state, that people are bound to report that to the authorities. And then that slave could be apprehended and returned. Well, question 2. I desire him to answer whether he stands pledged today, as he did in 1854, against the admission of any more slave states to the Union, even if the people want them. You know, one of the things that Douglas was advocating, if you remember earlier we talked about Kansas and Nebraska, these are territories that are approaching statehood. And if you remember, in the Missouri Compromise, it said that there would be no slavery north of the southern border of Missouri except Missouri. So Missouri was kind of the exception, right? But Nebraska and Kansas, I'm sure you know, are north of the southern boundary of Missouri. And so part of what Douglas is advocating and what others are advocating is that those territories be allowed to vote for whether they'll be slave or free states when admitted. And so, of course, you got to remember the only people that can vote here are white men. So he's saying, are you going to, even if the people want them? So that's what he's talking about, having this vote. Answer. I do not now, nor did I ever stand pledged against the admission of any more slave states into the Union. So these are answers you may not imagine that what Lincoln said, but Lincoln was quite, I think, guarded and quite moderate in his approach. Douglas, of course, trying to force him to answer his questions. Well, Abraham Lincoln loses this. He loses to Douglas. Douglas becomes a senator of Illinois. Abraham Lincoln has to return to his practice. But when it comes time for the election of 1860, we'll see that Abraham Lincoln will become the candidate for the Republican Party. we'll see in 1860 a very divided country and even divided political parties. You had Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. Neither of them were abolitionists. Neither of them wanted to remove slavery, but they did not agree on all points, and so they ran two different candidates. Plus, you had the Constitutional Union in the South, wanted to return things, to assure that slavery would not be illegal at all. So you had John Breckinridge, he was actually from Kentucky, and John Bell from the Constitutional Union. Lincoln in the Grand Old Party, or the Republicans, and Douglas, a Northern Democrat. Okay, and so you actually have these four people running for president all at once, and so obviously you're not going to get not going to get the majority, because at this point there's going to be people voting for all four of these. And so, in fact, there will be some states in which Lincoln's name does not even appear on the ballot running for president. And he will get, about 40% of the popular vote, but the majority of it in larger, more populous states in the North. So, GOP's victory was made likely, that there would be a lot of tension, because they're mainly going to get their votes from the North, since Lincoln didn't even appear on several ballots in the South. And some of them said, if this happens, we will secede from the U.S., we will form our own country. It will be called the CSA, not USA, but CSA, the Confederate States of America, will be a confederation of states that are basically going to be in the South. Abolitionists supported the GOP and Lincoln, but they thought he was not pro-abolitionist enough. Okay, so they supported him, but they did not support him at the level that of enthusiasm, I guess we'd say, if that makes sense to you. So this election of 1860, very interesting one, and you can spend a lot of time sort of analyzing all the details of it. The Northern Democrats used racial propaganda to appeal to voters, where they basically say, if you don't vote for us, you're just voting for a black political party, even though obviously Abraham Lincoln's not black. But this is their approach. And here you see a poster from that time, two platforms: the Democratic platform for the white man, the Republican platform is for the Negro. Okay, so they make this very, very clear in their advertising. Lincoln, of course, was very popular in the North. He won all but 3 electoral votes in free states. All but 3. Of course, this is what's going to give him the election. He did not win any electoral votes in slave states. In fact, as I said, he doesn't even appear on some of the ballots there. The Southern Democrats carry all of the South, but Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Okay. And so here you see we just had a big election, and of course it wasn't a presidential one, it was a midterm election. But when you have a presidential election, you start to see maps like this. These maps show electoral votes, because that's really how it's decided. And you see, for example, Abraham Lincoln in that sort of reddish color. And notice everywhere across the North and out in California and Oregon. Lincoln wins. And of course, when you win the electoral vote, you get all of those votes. Okay, that's the way the Electoral College works. Douglas wins in what? Where was it? He got the 3 electoral votes out of New Jersey. If you look over there, you can see he got 3 here in New Jersey, and then he got 9 from Missouri. Okay, so he won Missouri. Notice that Bell wins Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Remember, at this time, the western part of Virginia, which will fairly soon become West Virginia, was a part of Virginia. So you can see there, 24, what do we got? 2439 there. And then in the South, sweeping the South, although it has lower population, everywhere from North Carolina over to Texas is all this in the green color for Breckinridge, which is interesting because Breckinridge is from Kentucky. He does not win Kentucky. And Lincoln was born in Kentucky, and he does not win Kentucky. So very interesting. And also Maryland and Delaware go for Breckinridge. All right. So didn't quite sweep the South, mainly because it's divided. And then also, it's all divided. A lot of the sort of pro-slavery is divided into 3 candidates. So this really is what allows Abraham Lincoln to win. Well, within weeks of Abraham Lincoln's election, 7 states begin to organize into conventions to vote on succession, succeeding from the United States to form their own country, is really what they're wanting to do. They would form the Confederate States of America, which would be primarily, obviously, in the South. And that would leave the United States of America in the North and the West. All of those 7 states that got organized voted to secede. That includes Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia. So these are the first 7 states to vote to secede. By February of 1861, so this is basically about a year after Lincoln is voted in as president, the Confederate States of America had a constitution, and they had elected a president, Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis, by the way, was also from Kentucky. He was the provisional president. So they are getting themselves organized with a president and a constitution and so forth. But of course, not everyone in the South agreed about how secession should work or what it actually meant. Some of them did not want to trade a strong central government in the North for a strong central government in the South. Some were for conditional union. Some wanted to wait for a clear unified plan. So there were some other southern states that are, as you notice, Virginia is not a part of this. North Carolina, not a part of this. Maryland and so forth. They're waiting to see, is this really going to work? And how is it going to work before they wanted to commit to it? So here you see a map. I like maps. Maybe you do too, which I think makes some things clear in our minds. Here you see territories. They're kind of in the beige color. You've got Oklahoma, which is labeled Indian Territory. You got New Mexico, which basically includes Arizona and New Mexico, all the way over to California. You got Nevada and Utah territory, Colorado territory, Nebraska territory, Dakota territory, and Washington territory. Then, of course, on the West Coast, you got Oregon and California that are free states. And then you sweep across there, Kansas is a free state. You know, Kansas ended up having a big battle that many people say that's where the Civil War began, and eventually they came up with a constitution, one that was voted upon that allowed slavery. This was highly contested and not accepted by the federal government, and so they had another election for a constitution, and they finally enter, I think it's in 1861, as a free state. Then you can see Minnesota, Iowa, and so forth, all the way across New England, free states. Then you have what we could call, what are called border states. So Missouri is listed as a border state. It's a slave state, but it borders free states, as well as Kentucky. And you see that West Virginia has now divided from Virginia, and it's a border state, but it wanted to separate itself from the slave state of Virginia. You have Maryland and Delaware are also considered to be border states. You see that red line that runs from Texas all the way over to Maryland. Okay, so this is sort of the demarcation line of the Confederacy. Those become the Confederate States of America, CSA, and then border states, and then the North, okay, which normally is called the Union. All right, so there it is. I think that's pretty good. Notice Union free states, Union slave states, border. Slave states seceding before Fort Sumter in 1861. That's in the darker color. And then after Fort Sumter, that we'll probably end up talking about next time. Of course, you've heard of Fort Sumter, the beginning of the war, and then territories. So I think that's a pretty good map to give us this idea. All right, so here is a list of succession. Eventually, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Virginia, and Delaware had most of the heavy industry and most of the population. None of them initially voted to secede, and so they were conditional, what we might call conditional unionists. What were their conditions? That there would be a guarantee of slavery, but no coercion of the southern states. And then we have North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia did vote to secede after Fort Sumter, when there was an actual attack by Confederate forces, the first battle of the war. After Fort Sumter failed, secessionist resolutions went elsewhere. So they then join in. Okay, so Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. So you see them out of the list up there. So those border states did not succeed. So here is an interesting photograph. This is actually a photograph of the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. You can see the people gathered around the steps there. A little bit blurry because, they're moving. They didn't have fast shutters. They sort of had a manual shutter. So they'd just have to set this up on a tripod and open it up to take a picture. But it makes a pretty clear picture here of the setting. And this is of the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. So by the time he is actually inaugurated, the election is taken place in, late 1860. he will be inaugurated. And the inauguration at this time was actually later in the year. We now do the inauguration towards the end of January, but they did it in early March at that time. March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln is on this platform, on the steps, and he is inaugurated. In his address, of course, he has to address this idea that the country is divided. And he said he wanted to have a balance between the sword and the olive branch. Of course, the sword being warfare, conflict, perhaps bloodshed, and the olive branch, which is peace. Peace. And so this is how Abraham Lincoln has to begin his presidency. He vows to protect or reclaim federal property. This, of course, is a indication that if there is a succeeding or succession of states, that he takes that to be U.S. property, and he is not going to allow that to happen. He's going to attempt to reclaim any U.S. territory. But he does not really address slavery at this time. He is not calling for an invasion, that is, invasion of northern troops. But he says succession cannot be allowed to move forward. And so here we see a country, we believe our country is divided today. I'd say it is very divided today. But not to the level, I don't think even close to the level of what it was during the time of the Civil War. And where states are already organized to withdraw, and armed conflict is coming very, very soon. So we will take up the very beginnings of the Civil War in the next lecture, the next presentation. So I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.